Hello and welcome to Sam-Splaining Science. I'm Sam. I'm your host. I'll be Sam-Splaining the science. And today we're talking about red light masks. But before we get into that, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing well. As predicted, I hated the month of March. It happens every year, and every year I say I hate March, and then March comes along and reminds me why I hate it. So I did not post an episode for the entire month of March. And now we're like more than halfway through April. And here we are. But we're back, and that's what matters. And I hope you've been well. I hope you're good. I'm doing well. The weather is phenomenal here in New York City. It's literally the most spectacular day outside. So what better way than to spend it inside recording a podcast episode? Haha. But my windows are open. So that's also if you hear any like outside noise. Can I speak today? My God. I can not speak any day actually. But if you hear any outside, are you joking? Any outside noise? Jeez Louise, that took a while. But if you hear any outside noise, that's why. It's because my windows are open. And I'm not going to really try to edit it out. So you can just use it as like background noise, like we're chit-chatting on my stoop, you know? All good. But yeah, the weather has been gorgeous in New York City. I have been a very happy camper. You don't realize the winter is you do realize in the winter that it's like awful and cold and windy and snowy and just trash. But then when you get to spring, you're like, oh my God, that was awful. And this is so much better. So I'm in that phase now of like, wow, this is incredible. I'm a little sniffly and a little sneezy because the allergies are kicking my behind, but it's gorgeous. And it's just so comfortable. The weather, like where you can't feel it, you know, like it doesn't feel hot. It doesn't feel cold. It's just like comfortable. We're there. We've made it, folks. And I know it's not going to last forever. Trust me. I know that in a couple weeks, it's going to be 97 degrees with 98% humidity. But for now, we're staying in the present and we're appreciating it for what it is, which is beautiful. But yeah, things have been good, been busy, but I'm very excited to be back and recording for the podcast. Like I said, today's topic, we're talking about red light masks. And for me, I have been receiving a lot of ads on Instagram for red light masks. And I think it's just, you know, sort of being a woman in her 30s. Instagram is like, hey, you're getting old. Fix it, you know, marketing or whatever. So I've been seeing a lot of red light masks. And actually, a couple friends of mine use red light masks religiously. But for me, I'm like, is this a scam? Like, does this actually work? And if it works, how? What's the purpose of it? You know, how does it actually do what people say it does? So that's what we're going to cover in today's episode. And maybe you've been curious about this too. I hope so. I hope that's why you're listening. Or maybe you weren't curious and you just listened anyway, in which case I appreciate you. Thanks for being here and I love you. Okay. Without further ado, we're going to get into the questions for today's episode. If you're new here to Sam-Splaining Science, every episode we ask questions because asking questions is how you learn, or at least that's how I learn. So I ask questions. And I had a couple questions, like I said, when I started seeing red light masks everywhere. The first question is, what is red light? Now, I'm not going to lie to you. I already knew what red light was. But I think it's a good place to start for this episode, a nice kind of base level principle of the, what's the word I'm thinking of? I guess how the red light mask works. You need to know what red light is, right? So that's what we're getting into first. The second is, how does red light help with aging? So we'll kind of get into the proposed biological mechanism for red light and its impact on skin, specifically when it comes to aging. And then the third question is, okay, but does it actually work? And that's where we're going to get into more of like the clinical studies. I have a couple of clinical studies that have explored how red light masks work. So we're going to walk through those studies, the results from those studies, but also talk about the considerations and the limitations from those studies. So hopefully we'll answer all of these questions in this episode, and then you'll have a lot more information about red light masks and how they work. And then you can make a little bit of a more informed decision if you'd like to use one or not. This is not sponsored. This is not an ad, but just me sam-splaining science to the both of us, to be honest, because I don't really know. I didn't know what this was until I read about it. So sam-splaining science to you and I both. Cheers to that. Okay, let's get to question number 1, which is, what is red light? So when we say red light, like what does that actually mean? I mean, in very basic terms, it's just light that is red. But how is light red? Sometimes I think about, like, while I'm recording this, I'm like, this is the way that my brain works. I'm not sure if this is the way that everyone's brain works. And like listening to this, if your brain doesn't work like mine, must be miserable. That must be why I get like 2 downloads an episode. People are like, this bitch is insufferable. But it's okay. We're here anyway. But in order to maybe sam-splain a little bit at a little bit of a higher level, what red light is, we have to revisit our old friend, the electromagnetic spectrum. I've talked about the electromagnetic spectrum in a couple of episodes now. If you have forgotten, this spectrum, the EM spectrum, defines or really classifies radiation as basically based on its energy level. So the spectrum kind of ranges from very high energy rays, like radiation sources, like a gamma ray, for example, on the high end, to the low end being lower energy, like radio waves. And in the middle of this spectrum lies what we call the visible light spectrum. So visible light has a lower energy than radioactive rays, but a higher energy than radio waves. And we can kind of define how much energy radiation has based on some properties of the radiation wave. So, for example, or I guess one principle of light is that it acts as a particle. You can think of it as like a light ray, like a photon is like a particle of light. And as light travels, it has sort of like a wave-like path to it. And the distance between the top of one wave to the top of the next wave is called a wavelength. Different wavelengths carry different energies. So when you have a lower wavelength, you're going to have more energy. And when you have a higher wavelength, you're going to have lower energy. Wait, what did I just say? It's opposite. So if the wavelength is lower, it's more energy. And if what am I saying? Hello? Am I good? No, I think I am saying it right. Oh my God. I need coffee. That's the problem. If the wavelength is higher, it has lower energy. And if the wavelength is lower, it has higher energy. So all the way on the high side of the spectrum, like the gamma rays, that has a very short wavelength. And then all the way on the low energy side of the spectrum, the radio waves, they have a very long or high wavelength. Within the visible light spectrum, we see different colored lights, and we can classify the different color lights based on their wavelengths. So, for example, violet, purple lights tend to have a lower wavelength and higher energy. But red light, which is on the other end of the visible light spectrum, is closer to the lower energy side of the electromagnetic spectrum that has a higher wavelength and has lower energy. So this is all to say that what is red light? Red light is relatively low energy visible light that we can see that has a relatively high wavelength compared to other visible light. Typically the red wavelengths are between 620 to 780 nanometers compared to blue or purple light, which has between like 380 to like 450 nanometers. So basically red light has 620 to 780 nanometer wavelengths, and that relates to a lower energy visible light within the electromagnetic spectrum. So now knowing and understanding that red light has this sort of window of 620 to 780 nanometers of wavelength, that's like a kind of crucial piece of information that we'll kind of see pop up throughout the rest of the episode. But that's like the summary of what red light is. Relatively low energy, relatively high wavelength compared to other colors on the visible light spectrum. So now getting into the second question, which is how does red light actually help with aging? To answer this question, I'm going to use a figure from one of the clinical studies that we'll talk about in a little bit, but they did a really great job in this clinical study explaining the theory behind why red light is of such interest when it comes to having an impact on skin aging. So this figure, hell yeah. I'm using the laser pointer in Google Slides because I learned how to do that. This figure, which is from this clinical study by Cotrod et al., published just a couple years ago, shows the difference between the penetration depth of light through our skin. So our skin, and this is another throwback to my tattoo episode, I believe. So our skin has many layers, and the group of cells at the very top layer is called the epidermis. That's the very outer layer of your skin. And then under the epidermis is the dermis. I thought they were coming for me. Just kidding. I wanted to see if I would need to pause, but I think we're in the clear. Okay. So under the epidermis is the dermis, or the dermal layer of the skin. And this figure shows really nicely that lower wavelength, higher energy light really does not penetrate past the epidermis. So you have like the violet light, and even like past violet light on the spectrum is ultraviolet light, like the UV rays from sun. They don't really penetrate too deeply into the skin layers. It really doesn't get past the dermis. Blue light, similarly, doesn't really get too far past the epidermis. But the lower energy, higher wavelength light, like red light or even infrared light, can penetrate deeper into the dermal layer, that deeper layer of our skin. And in that layer of our skin, we have something called opsins, which are basically like proteins that react to certain stimuli that can trigger other processes. So we have these opsins in our dermis that will respond to the red or infrared light and trigger biological processes within the dermis. So one example is that opsins can activate a protein called TGF-beta that's transforming growth factor beta. And TGF beta controls cell growth and cell division, and cell differentiation. So if an opsin in our skin, in our dermis, is activated by red or infrared light, it can trigger TGF beta to promoting cell development and cell growth within our skin. Another example is that opsins can activate cytochrome C oxidase, which is an enzyme that can promote the development, or promote the development's not the right word, promote the synthesis, that's the right word, of ATP, which is our body's energy. Wow, why are words so hard for me today? Currency. There we are. ATP is our body's energy currency. And cytochrome C oxidase can promote the production of ATP. That gives the cells within the dermis more energy to grow, which was stimulated by TGF beta. So those are two examples of how how red light and infrared light can sort of promote cell activity within the skin. Additionally, going back for a second to TGF beta can activate fibroblasts, which are cells that live within the dermal layer of our skin. They live other places too, but they live in the dermal layer of our skin. And these fibroblasts create proteins like collagen and elastin, which are both really important for the extracellular matrix, which is basically like the scaffolding and the structure that holds up and supports our cells. So with TGF beta being activated by the opsins that are reacting to red light or infrared light, that TGF beta can activate the fibroblasts that create collagen and elastin and really give the cells in the dermal layer structural support to strengthen them. One word that can be used to describe this entire thing is photobiomodulation. One of the longer words that I've said personally in my lifetime. But basically, photo meaning light, and biomodulation meaning there's like cellular processes that can trigger changes to the tissue, the cells that make up the tissue, if you will. So photobiomodulation is really this whole reaction of the light penetrating through the epidermis into the dermis of the skin, that light stimulating opsins that trigger the activation of TGF beta and cytochrome C oxidase, which have downstream effects on fibroblasts and their energy and their production of collagen and elastin, which support the structure of the skin cells in the dermis. So that's sort of this whole process. Photobiomodulation. Pretty interesting. Something that I didn't know. And apparently this is like pretty well established. There were quite a few citations within this paper that talk about the study of red light and infrared light on the activity of cells within the dermis. So it's legitimate. It's not just like hey, what if this happens? It's like pretty well characterized at this point, this process of photobiomodulation. So I thought that was interesting. Learned something new. A couple of other things that I want to mention before we move on to question number 3 is that we're talking about like red light therapy as it relates to reducing the appearance of aging skin, right? What aging skin really means, I guess, what happens, the characteristics of aging skin are things like wrinkles and fine lines, as well as things like a decreased density of the skin and a decreased like firmness of the skin. So I guess the point here with photobiomodulation is that the downstream effects of like the light sensitive opsins in the dermis promote cell development, which leads to tissue regeneration and tissue repair, which then some studies suggest may reduce this aged appearance of the skin. And specifically within this spectrum of light, red light and infrared light, which have wavelengths around 600 to 700 nanometers for visible red light and 700 to 1100 nanometers for the infrared light, which is not visible to the human eye. These wavelengths are the most effective at stimulating those opsins because they penetrate through to the dermis better than light that has shorter wavelengths and higher energy. One last thing, and then I promise we'll move on to question 3, is that this paper notes that the process of photobiomodulation takes a few days to sort of reach its peak. So the exposure to red light and infrared light kind of starts the chain of events, but the actual process of the photobiomodulation, the actual impact on the cells and the regeneration of cells, takes about 3 days to reach its maximum impact. And that's an important note that we'll get into in the next slide, I believe, in the next question. I think that's all that I wanted to cover for this one. So now we can move on to a couple of clinical studies that explore red light masks in their impact in reducing the appearance of aging in skin. And I use that in quotes, and I might or might not have a very long rant at the end of this episode about aging and the appearance of aging, but we'll get into that later. Now we'll stick to the science and keep my opinions to the side. Okay, so moving on to question number 3, which is, okay, but does it actually work? Because like, I understand the thought process behind this, and it seems really cool and really interesting, but is it practical? Can it be translated to human skin in a way that is efficacious? Efficacious, I think that's the right word. I don't know. What do I know? I'm not a linguist. Never claimed to be. Never will be. Well, never say never. Okay. So the question, does it actually work? I have summarized 2 clinical studies with an asterisk in understanding that there are many clinical studies. I simply don't have the time nor energy to read every single clinical study. So if by chance you've read a clinical study on red light masks and you think it's better than the ones that I'm summarizing, please send them to me because I would like to learn more. And I maybe would, do a follow-up episode to say, here's some more information for anyone interested. I chose these 2 because they were open source. It's quite simple. But if you have more information, please send it to me. I'm always happy to learn more. But the first clinical study that we're looking at is by Coutraud. They're French, and I'm not. And I think that makes it a little difficult to pronounce their name. But this was a study published in 2023. It's linked below, of course, as always. I didn't give that spiel yet this episode, but as you know, I always cite my sources. They're always in the link. The links are always in the episode description. Because I'm not one to, oh my God, why can't I think of words today? Plagiarize. You know what? I have it. It's just my mind panics and then I can't think of the word. I'm not one to plagiarize, so I'm always going to cite my sources. And you can find the link to this paper in the description of the episode. But this is a study done by a company in France. The device was called the Skin Light Dior. I spelled Dior wrong on the slide. In my notes, it's fine, but on the slide, I'm realizing I spelled it wrong. My bad. this is the knockoff Dior. Just kidding. But the mask was called the Skinlight Dior and Lucibel mask. So Lucibel is the company that sort of ran this clinical trial in partnership with Dior. They developed this LED mask that emits light, red light, at 630 nanometers. And the way that the mask works is that it's a 12-minute session of emitting this 630 nanometer red light. And participants of the study were encouraged to do these LED mask sessions twice a week for 3 months. And they made sure that these sessions were separated by at least 3 days. Because again, as I mentioned previously, to get the peak effective photobiomodulation, it takes a couple of days to reach the peak. So they wanted to space out the sessions enough so that you could have time for the photobiomodulation to take its peak. So there were 20 volunteers in the study, just 20. We'll get into that a little later. Between the ages of 45 and 70 years old, and all 20 volunteers were white. And we'll get into that a little later too, but I think it's important to note here. For the methods, or like the methodology of the study, what they did was they had 2 sessions a week for 12 minutes each. They didn't change any other process of their skincare routines. So everyone may have a different skincare routine. The only thing that everyone had in common was this 12-minute session twice a week being exposed to 630 nanometers of red light for 3 months. The investigators took measurements monthly. So they took it before starting the treatment, 1 month after starting the treatment, 2 months, and 3 months after starting the treatment. And they took a lot of measurements. I'm not going to cover all of them just for the sake of time, but 2 that I will be talking about, which are more visual so we can see, are Life Viz microphotographs, from which they did a wrinkle analysis to determine how deep the wrinkles were, specifically in the crow's feet or the periorbital area. And then they also did ultrasound density on the cheek to look at the they also did ultrasound imaging to look at skin density on the cheek, to look at the layer of the skin and the cells within the dermis and the epidermis above it. So those are the 2 results that I'm going to show in depth, but they also tested a lot of other components of skin health and skin aging, like pore size, like complexion homogeneity, like I think oil content of the skin. Like they did a lot of measurements. But again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through every single one, just the ones that we have prettier pictures for. Sorry to cherry pick, but sometimes you gotta. Prioritization and whatnot. So let's get into the results from this study. So again, one of the first things that they looked at was the depth of the wrinkle in the crow's feet, which again is like kind of right to the side of your eye. Like when you smile, there's sometimes like, I got plenty of them, girl, don't worry. But you have like wrinkles kind of coming out of the corner of your eye. Those are the crow's feet wrinkles. And they took pictures before starting the treatment and monthly throughout the 3-month treatment process. And they were able to measure, based on the images and image processing, the depth of the wrinkle in the crow's feet area. And the study reported that on average, the participants had a 38.3% decrease in the depth of their crow's feet wrinkle after using the red light mask for 3 months, twice a week. So they have both the summary of the mean change in depth of the crow's feet wrinkle as like a bar chart. But they also have like an image side by side, so you can visually appreciate the difference in the depth of the crow's feet wrinkle compared to day 0 when they start the treatment and day 84 at the end of the 3 months. They also had measurements for the 1 month and 2 month period, and they also found that there were significant decreases even at 1 month. But the 1 month decrease was about 15.6%, so not as significant, or I shouldn't say not as dramatic, but still statistically significant. And then at 2 months, the decrease in the crow's feet wrinkle depth was 34.7%. So pretty close to what it was at day 84. So I guess one way to think about it is that it's not always like a linear, like stepwise improvement. It kind of like has this drastic improvement over 2 months, and then it kind of slows down from 2 to 3. But I thought this was an interesting way to describe it, albeit, again, a small sample size and some other issues that we'll get into in a little bit. But the other result that I wanted to show was the difference in skin density. So again, they measured this using ultrasound, and they were able to look at the layers of the skin and the cells that were in the epidermis and the dermal layers of the skin at day 0, 28, 56, and 84. So month, like the start of the treatment, and then monthly until 3 months after treatment. And what they found was an increase in the dermis density. So they have on the right-hand side, they have example images where this bright white line is, I believe, the epidermis, the outer layer of the skin. And then the greenish dots are cells within the dermis. And I think the intensity of the image indicates the density of cells in that area. So you'll notice that the epidermis is very, very, very bright because there are a lot of cells in the epidermis. And then as you kind of go deeper into the dermal layer, it becomes more of like a green because there's less cells per unit area, or I should say fewer cells per unit area. Maybe I am a linguist. I'm correcting my own grammar. But there's fewer cells per area in the dermis, so it's a little more spread out on day 0. But when we look at the dermal layer on day 0 and we compare it to the dermal layer on day 56, the dermal layer on day 56 has a lot more red and yellow color, which indicates an increase in the cell density in the dermal layer after 56 days. So going to the quantitative analysis, between day 0 and day 56, there was a 41% increase in the dermal density. After 3 months, so after the full trial, there was an increase in the dermal density of 47.7%. So again, the only thing, or I guess I should say, with a twice a week regimen of this red light mask, the study results suggest that this red light mask has had a positive impact on the skin density within the dermal layer, which is in line with the hypothesis and the theory of the red light and infrared light, in this case, the red light, because it's 630 nanometers, the red light getting through the epidermal cell into the dermal layer, and kind of going through that whole chain of events that promote cell proliferation and cell growth in the dermis. So I thought this was pretty cool to see too. The last data slide that I'll show for this is a summary of all of the measurements that they took. Again, I'm not going to kind of go into all of them just because there are quite a few here. But one thing I want to highlight is that these, the authors report a change, sometimes not always statistically significant, but they show trends of changes in almost every measurement that they took. And that includes things like pore diameter, so like how big your pores are, skin texture, like roughness of the cheek, skin homogeneity. So thinking about like the tone of your skin and if it's kind of even throughout your face, or if you have like different skin tones in different areas. your girl's got a little bit of rosacea. You can't really tell in this lighting, but your girl's got a little bit of rosacea. So I was interested in this one personally. But yeah, they showed that between 1, 2, and 3 month time periods, they had a trend at the very least of change and improvement in the skin characteristics over time. So let's talk about the conclusions and considerations for this study. I guess a summary point here is that the data from this study support that the routine use of this LED mask that they developed can reverse the sign of skin aging. And I use that in quotes as well. For the purpose of this episode, I only talked about the wrinkle depth and the skin cell density. But the results in the full publication really do show a decrease in roughness of the skin, a decrease in pore diameter, an increase in skin firmness. So a lot of the measurements that they looked at did have changes over the course of the treatment, over the 3 months of treatment. Another thing to note that I didn't report on in the results section, but they did mention in the paper, is that all 20 of the participants felt that the mask had significantly improved the condition of their skin. And this was based on a satisfaction questionnaire. So whether it's the placebo effect, regardless, all 20 people felt better about their skin after the process. And that kind of brings us to our limitations for the study. In the study design, there was no control group. So there was no, people who weren't getting the therapy and seeing how their skin changed over time. So that's one thing to consider, that there really is there's just an experimental group and not a control group. And, we can't really determine significant differences from this mask by itself. They also didn't control for things like skincare or cleansing or makeup. They did note that during the measurements and the acquisition of the images, there was no makeup or no, they were on clean faces with no makeup, but they didn't control for makeup use outside of the measurements. So that might have an effect on skin quality, especially for things like, I don't know, I'm thinking when I wear makeup, like my skin gets like kind of oily and I don't know, whatever. So another thing to consider that they didn't control for in this study. Another limitation, I mentioned this earlier, but all 20 of the participants were Caucasian. So it was only tested on white skin. I'm not sure how a difference in skin tone and melanin concentration may impact that, but no diversity in clinical trials. This was published in 2023. What are we doing? That's all I'll say about that. And then it's also difficult to define, and this was something that they mentioned as well, especially for some of the measures that didn't have as noticeable of a change, was that it's hard to define the best dose or the best exposure to the LED light, the red light. So because of that, there are, I guess, limitations to how well it can work until they can optimize or standardize a protocol that will give the best results. So a couple things to consider there. But overall, I was pretty impressed with this study. Again, given it's only 20 people, I'm not going to put all my life savings toward buying one of these, but I think the visuals were really interesting to see, the comparisons and the side-by-sides. So interesting to see. I read about another study, another clinical trial that tested a different LED red light mask. And this study explored the efficacy of that mask for, again, reversing the signs of skin aging. So this mask, different from the first one that we talked about, it emits red light at about 660 nanometers, so a little bit of a longer wavelength than the previous one. And the sessions, instead of 12 minutes for the previous study, were 21 minutes for this study. This study was a little bit better powered in terms of sample size. So there were 95 participants, and the 95 participants were divided into 3 groups. So all of the groups received a treatment intervention for 4 weeks, and the participants were between the ages of 45 and 60 years old. I will say I tried to double check the paper. I didn't see any information on ethnicity or race, so I don't know if this study was more diverse than the previous one. But that's just kind of like a side note. But yeah, the 95 participants were divided into 3 different groups. So group 1 received 2 LED red light mask sessions per week. Group 2 received 3 LED red light mask sessions per week. And then group 3 was sort of like a sham control group where they went in for 2 sessions a week, but they didn't turn the mask on. So like the red light in the mask wasn't on, but instead, to make them think that they were getting a red light treatment, the lights in the room were covered with red cellophane. So like in a way, they're low-key getting exposed to red light in a way, but not directly on their face like the other 2 groups were. But I thought that was interesting, and I was like, at least this they're trying to have a control group. The other study didn't even try. So I'm like, I respect the hustle. I respect them, the effort. But yeah, so group 1 got 2 sessions a week, group 2, 3 sessions a week, and group 3 got technically no sessions a week, but they did go in for 2 sessions every week. So the study, I guess the data collection throughout this study was really based off of images of wrinkles in different regions of the face. So we'll get into it on the next slide, but they talked about the wrinkles on your forehead. I think they're called worry lines. They talked about the glabellar wrinkles, which are the ones between your eyebrows, the 11s. Although mine, I just have 1. So mine's just a 1, but that's a wrinkle that they looked at. They looked at the periorbital or the crow's feet wrinkles. And then they also looked at the nasolabial or the smile line. Honestly, reading this literature just made me hyper aware of the lines on my face, and I kind of hated it, but we'll get into it again later when I have my rant at the end. But yeah, so this study took images of these wrinkles across different areas of the participant's face. And then from those images, they collected 2 measurements. So one measurement that they did was 3 specialists rated the wrinkles on a wrinkle assessment scale, which is essentially a number scale from 0 to 4, where 0 is there is no wrinkle, and 4 is a very extreme wrinkle. So 3 specialists looked at all the pictures of the forehead, the periorbital, the nasolabial, and the glabellar wrinkles, and scored them 0 through 4 for like wrinkle intensity. Which is kind of like, in a way, it's subjective because it's people just like kind of ranking on a scale. So in an attempt to have a more quantitative measure, the study also used ImageJ, which is an image analysis software that I've actually used. Not to brag, but when I saw ImageJ, I was like, hey, I know you. But they used this software to analyze the same images that the specialist scored. And they used ImageJ to quantify the length of the wrinkle. Another measurement that was taken throughout the study had nothing to do with the images. It was a patient satisfaction questionnaire called the FACE-Q. So again, they had 3 groups, various number of sessions per week, and they took images and scored them both qualitatively by the specialists and quantitatively with ImageJ to determine the effects over the course of the treatment, which I forget if I mentioned this yet, but the treatment lasted 4 weeks. So group 1 had a total of 8 sessions 2 per week for 4 weeks. Group 2 had a total of 12 sessions, 12 sessions, 3 per week for 4 weeks. And then group 3 had 8 sham sessions. So 2 sham sessions per 4 weeks. Okay. I was going to say, any questions? Bitch, it's just you. It's just you. But if you do have any questions, you can DM me. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Just unfortunately not in real time. But anyway, let's move on to the results. And let me fix my posture a little bit. My butt is falling asleep. Okay. So first, we'll talk about the results from the Wrinkle Assessment Scale, or the WAS. This study reported for forehead wrinkles no difference between pre and post-treatment wrinkle assessment scale, and also no difference between groups for forehead wrinkles. So essentially, between the groups, the number of sessions or even the sham did not have an impact on the qualitative rating of the wrinkle assessment scale in the forehead by those 3 specialists. However, various combinations of the glabellar wrinkles, the nasolabial lines, or the smile lines. I'm just going to use the normal human terms, okay? So glabellar is the 11s, the nasolabial line is the smile lines, and then the periorbital lines are the crow's feet. So for the 11s, the smile lines, and the crow's feet, there were significant differences in the rating scales before and after treatment. So there was a difference from week 0 to week 4 in the rating scale for each of those wrinkles. However, there was no difference between the groups. So that means that even the sham, even the control group, had a reduction or a difference. In this case, it is a reduction in the 11s, the crow's feet, and the smile lines. So I thought that was interesting. I'm saying, what are we doing here? Even the shams are getting a benefit. So what's in the water there? And can I have some? But I think one thing that they mentioned, maybe I'll get into it a little later because I know we're going long on time and I have a whole considerations and limitations section. So we'll just get into that later. Okay. So now moving on to the more, hello? Okay. Sorry, I had to move my person. Now for the more quantitative results, where again, they use like the image processing software to measure the length of the wrinkles before and after the treatment for all of the groups. And they did some statistics to parse out which groups at which wrinkles had the most significant difference between pre and post treatment. And what they found was that with the quantification of the length of the wrinkle, there actually was a statistically significant difference in the forehead wrinkle for group 2, which is the group that had the 3 sessions per week for 4 weeks, which resulted in, I'm going to say like a 15% change. How good was that math off the top of my head? I should have done this before I started recording. I'm sorry about that. But the average was 73 minus 62 divided by 73. It's freaking 15. One thing about me, I love math. And math loves me. And I don't know, I'm just blessed, I guess, and really, really smart. Remember when I couldn't pronounce words like 10 seconds ago? Anyway, okay. So on average, the forehead wrinkle was 15% shorter after 4 weeks of treatment, when the treatment was 3 21-minute sessions per week for 4 weeks. Additionally, within the 11s, both groups 1 and 2 had a statistically significant reduction in the length of their 11 wrinkles. Again, those are the ones like between your eyebrows. However, group 3 did not have a statistically significant difference in the length between their 11s before and after treatment. And then, I should note here that they didn't do the quantification for the nasolabial, like the smile line. And that's because the length of that really depends on the distance from the nose to like the tip of your nose to the corner of your lip, which is different because people look different, and that's a beautiful thing. But it was apparently like too variable, so they didn't do that analysis. But they did do the analysis for the periorbital or the crow's feet. And they found that for the right side, both groups 1 and group 2 had significant difference, a significant reduction in the length of the crow's feet wrinkle. But for the left side, only group 2 had a statistically significant difference between pre and post crow's feet length. So it seems like and they talk about this in like the discussion, the image quantification or the image analysis that allows for actual like quantification of the wrinkle versus just a subjective like, oh, this wrinkle is, a moderate wrinkle versus a mild wrinkle versus an extreme wrinkle. Like the quantification is a lot more sensitive to the changes that might be seen, because it seems to be detecting a little bit more of those differences between groups, or not between groups, but between before and after treatment within each group. So an interesting approach. And I think we'll get into the discussion a little bit more about some of the considerations. The last result from this study that I want to share, I promise we're almost done. I promise I'll shut up soon. No, I won't. But the last piece of the results that they shared was the results from the patient satisfaction questionnaire. Here, I'm going to skip over being a little nitpicky about the statistics because, one, who's got the time? But I will say, they reported that groups 1 and 2, again, those are the two groups that had the LED red light therapy either 2 or 3 times a week. Those groups had the highest % improvement in the satisfaction of their skin, or like the overall skin appearance, with a 79.62% improvement for group 1 and a 73.46% improvement for group 2. One thing to note is that group 3, the sham, the controls who didn't actually receive the red light therapy but had like red cellophane over a ceiling light, reported an improvement of 46.09%. So take with that what you will. The people who didn't even receive the therapy noted an improvement in their facial features or their facial appearance of almost 50%. I also put some of the tables with like the original, like the pre and the post treatment scores of their facial appearance and their opinion on their facial appearance. But I for the sake of time, I'm not going to dive into it. I've been talking for far too long. You probably aren't listening anymore, and I respect it. If you are listening, you're probably like, when is this going to end? And I'll tell you, we're going to talk about the discussion right now. And then we're going to get into the final takeaways, and then I'm going to say my goodbyes. Promise. Love you. Mean it. Okay. So for this study, the second clinical study that we walked through today, the data support that the use of a red light LED mask might improve the appearance of wrinkles. However, they noted that the wrinkle assessment scale, or the WAS, did not provide as sensitive of a measure of the change before and after treatment as the ImageJ quantitative measures did. A lot of their discussion because I was really speculative of this study because they did have the sham control group, but especially for the patient satisfaction, like there was a decent improvement in the satisfaction of a person's appearance, even if they were in the control group. So I'm like, how much of this is actually like the placebo effect of people thinking that they're getting this, so they're like feeling better about themselves and they're feeling more confident, even if it's not doing anything to like the actual wrinkles on their skin. So I was a little speculative, to be honest with you. I'm not 100% convinced, but one of the things that the authors really focused on was that, again, the WAS, the wrinkle assessment scale, might not be sensitive enough to pick up on the slight changes, but the quantitative analysis, was able to pick up on even slight changes, but significant changes in wrinkle length across the groups as well. A point that the authors made in the discussion too, was about this process of photobiomodulation and how it depends on a lot of parameters, including the wavelength, including the exposure time or the treatment time. So things like the frequency of the treatment, as well as the interval between the sessions, or even like total treatments within a study, really need to be considered for additional trials, but also for clinical use and clinical outcomes. Because there's a lot of opportunity to have differences and variability in a lot of those parameters, like, a 630 versus a 660 wavelength, or a treatment time of 12 minutes versus 21 minutes. There are a lot of differences between masks that could lead to differences in results. So there's definitely a need for like a harmonized or with at least within a mask to optimize the protocol to get the best results. And that's something that they mentioned in their study. One other consideration that they mentioned was that for the quantitative analysis, so for the image analysis where they quantified the length of the wrinkles, they mentioned that they didn't have a good way to standardize the photographs and that they didn't include like a ruler for scale within the image. So it was hard to kind of know like if the image is like zoomed in a lot or not. So that was one thing that they mentioned is important to consider for future trials as well. But overall, it seems at least that from the quantitative measures, there is some significant change in the skin, especially the wrinkle length, with using the red light versus not using the red light. And again, this change was over 4 weeks. Different studies, so not a head-to-head comparison, but what we saw in the first study was that when the measurements were taken 1 month, 2 months, and 3 months after the start of the treatment, you noticed changes between month 2 and month 3, or month 1 and month 2, and month 2 and month 3. But, this study was only for 4 weeks, so you don't really know, like, if they continued on, the participants, if they would have more obvious changes in the wrinkle appearance from the subjective scale, so that maybe the WAS or the wrinkle assessment scale could have had more significant changes if the participants were able to do those sessions longer, like for, another month or 2 or whatnot. But interesting to see for sure. Okay, I'll stop yapping. No, I won't. We still have our takeaways. The takeaways from today's episode. So hopefully today we learned that red light can penetrate into the dermal layer of our skin. And when it does so, it can trigger photosensitive proteins called opsins that can activate pathways within our cells that promote cell activity, cell growth, and can strengthen the extracellular matrix by the production of those proteins, collagen and elastin. We talked about a couple of clinical studies that support the claim that red light LED masks can potentially improve skin appearance, including things like wrinkle length and depth, as well as skin texture and skin density. But it's important to know that there are a lot of variables that might make the efficacy of some of these red light masks variable. Duh. The variables are going to make it variable. Could you believe? But more work should be done to sort of standardize the protocol to make sure that the mask has the optimal instructions for use to get the best results. And this last point here is where I will go off on a little bit of a tangent. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, I've been getting a lot of ads about like, oh, you need to fix your skin because you're in your 30s and whatever, blah, blah, blah. And I understand if you agree with that and you want to go out and buy a red light mask to stop wrinkles from happening. All the power to you, girly or boy or persony. But I do also want to kind of put the preface out there that aging is a blessing, and like wrinkles are evidence that we are living and that we have lived, and that's not a bad thing. So I understand if you want to go out and buy a red light mask and try to prevent wrinkles from happening or try to fix the fine lines or fix the pores or whatnot. And there are also other uses to red light. I don't think I said this. I forget if I said this, but red light has also been studied in other clinical cases as well for things like acne, inflammation, dark spots, even in some cases like muscle recovery and like pain. So there is a lot of utility for red light for various types of therapy. And if you choose it for therapy for skin appearance, by all means. But I am not an influencer, and I am not here to tell you, you need to get this. Girl, live your life and do what you want to do. And I say girl is a gender neutral term, because if you're not a girl, you're still a girl. But yeah, don't feel like if you have crow's feet or you have smile lines that you have to go and spend freaking $600 on a red light mask to prevent that from happening. I say don't. And frankly, even though I've learned about it and I think that it's really interesting, I'm not going to spend $600 on a freaking red light mask to stop things from happening that have happened for the history of human existence. If I like my wrinkles, because when you say stupid shit to me, like, I don't know. I think that they're expressive, and I think that they're evidence that I've lived. And now I'm just I'm looking at myself solely in the camera. Okay. But yeah, no, I mean, do what you want to do. God bless and Godspeed, but don't feel like you have to. I think the skin you're in is absolutely perfect the way that it is. But if you are a company that sells red light masks and you'd like to send me one for free, you can reach out to me at samsplainingsci.bsky.social, and I'll listen. I'll send a reply for free. Hell yeah. Absolutely. Let me know. Hit me up. All right. That's all for this week's episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please don't forget to follow, rate, and review the episode wherever you're listening. And please subscribe on YouTube. You can also follow the show on social media. The handle is at samsplainingsci. And you can connect with me on social media and ask questions if you'd like. My DMs are always open. You can also ask questions at samsplainingscience.com/ask. So if you have anything that you want me to samsplain to you, ask away. Let me know. Thank you again for listening, for tuning in to this week's episode. I hope you learned a little bit. I hope you laughed a little bit. I hope you love the skin you're in. And if you so choose to use red light therapy to change the appearance of your skin, God bless and Godspeed. Hopefully you know the science behind it now. Thanks again, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.